Hello again everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are taking a look at the FlyingIron Simulations Focke-Wulf FW190 A-8. The aircraft recently released for the sim, and without a doubt my favourite category of aircraft to fly within Microsoft Flight Simulator would be the Warbirds. FlyingIron of course makes some of the best Warbirds for the platform, so I was certainly very keen to take a look. I always enjoy these flights and these reviews. For our flight today then, we are currently on the ground at ChicoMick's excellent freeware Duxford aerodrome. And as you can see, we've got a bit of a crowd behind us here waiting for an aerial display. We're going to oblige here with the Würger. As usual, we'll carry out a full startup, we'll carry out a few manoeuvres over the field, we'll head off for some aerial work and we'll come back for a full stop landing. At the end of the video, we'll finish up with a conclusion section. I'll give you my overall thoughts and opinions on the product. I do hope you enjoyed the video. There should be plenty of nice flyby shots here today of the FW190. As always, if you do enjoy what you see, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel. And if you would like to help support my content further, you can do so by becoming a channel member or patron. Okay, so today then we find ourselves in the cockpit of another absolutely excellent FlyingIron Simulations aircraft. Today, of course, we are taking a look at the Focke-Wulf FW190 A-8. As mentioned, we are currently on the ground at Duxford, and as you can see, we've got quite a crowd here for our flight today, so we'll put on a good show for them. One quick look here around the cockpit before we get things underway, and as ever, as you can see, FlyingIron Simulations have done an absolutely superb job with the visuals and the modelling of the add-on. As well, we get the typically included FlyingIron tablet. We'll take more of a look at that towards the end of the flight. For now though, for our before start checks, we'll come down to the forward brake panel initially, take the battery master on. Same here as well for the generator breaker, the FUG25 breaker, that's our onboard IFF system, and also relates to the onboard radios. So we'll take that on, same as well for the ignition starter, the pitot heat. Light suit heating not required, we'll take the cabin lights on, navigation lights on, and as well take the flight instrument breaker in. No need of course here today for the gun sight and armament breakers. So we'll close up the forward brake panel for the rear brake panel, we'll take the FUG16 radio master on. Same as well for the landing gear drive, the flaps, the prop drive, the prop pitch, as well the horizontal stab trim, the artificial horizon, the engine driven generator, and the repeater compass. Lastly, taking the landing gear actuation breaker, we can leave the FUG25 self-destruction breaker out for obvious reasons. So closing up the rear brake panel for the armament breakers, we'll leave all of those out, just confirming they are. External power not connected to the aircraft here today, so we can leave the breaker out. For the oxygen valve, we'll set that through to open. And showing about 120 kilograms per centimetre squared there on the oxygen pressure. For the engine start checks, for the fuel tanks, the forward tank showing above 400 litres. Same as well there in the aft tank, and no lights there for the forward and aft fuel warnings. The fuel pumps, we'll take the forward tank fuel pump on, same as well for the rear tank pump. And for the fuel valve, we'll come through to automatic or through to the open position. And as you can see, we do have positive fuel pressure. The primer, we're looking for between 8 and 10 strokes here on the primer, so we'll split the difference, we'll go for 9. And notice the animation here on the primer as well. As we actually prime, the handle gets a little bit stiffer. You can see the animation gets a little bit slower, so a really nice touch there. And the engine is primed. The magnetos can go through to both, so mag 1 and 2. Throttle will set through to the start position. For the prop control, we'll just briefly come through to manual. And just cycling the manual prop control here, making sure things work correctly, we'll come through to the 12 o'clock position. And back through to auto, we should see the prop in the 12:30 position, which we do. According to the checklist, we want to close up the canopy here ahead of the start, but we'll leave the canopy open, firstly so that we can listen to the sounds of that BMW 801, and as well we'll leave the canopy open here for the taxi, just for the aid of our visibility. So checking the prop area, everything's clear, we'll give everybody a shout.
Clear prop!
And for the start itself, initially pushing in the starter handle, that's going to spool up the onboard flywheel for the inertial starter. That should take around 20 to 25 seconds. And of course we can just use the audio here of the flywheel to listen out for the maximum RPM. Okay, so the flywheel's stable. Now all we need to do is pull the start handle, the BMW 801 roaring into life. So we do have a good start. Oil temperature just come up through 65 degrees. The oil temperature does come up rather quickly, it has to be said, probably unrealistically so. And it's worth noting as well, the details provided in the checklist are a lot more limited versus the BF109, so less parameters given in terms of what we're looking for. As well, there's no detailed run-up procedure. Anyway, for the after starts, radiator is set through to fully open. Altimeter we can set. Got a QNH of 1017. Artificial horizon is uncaged, the compass heading looks good. For the flaps, we'll set those through to the takeoff position. I believe that equates to about 13 degrees, so we've got a good indication there on the left, same as well there on the right. You can see the flap indication just towards the trailing edge of the wing. For the pitch trim, we'll come through to 0 degrees. Pitch trim in the aircraft is actually just a switch, which must be a little bit fiddly in the real world for the pilots. We'll carry out a flight control check, so we've got full left and full right there on the ailerons. And same in reverse. Full up and full down on the elevator. And full left, full right here on the rudder. So the flight controls are full free and in the correct sense. Once again, the checklist does call for the canopy to be closed up, but we're going to leave that open here for the taxi, just to aid us in terms of our visibility. We can look out to the nose here as we swing the aircraft around. We're going to do exactly that. We'll swing out to the right, come back round through a 270-degree turn, and we can head out towards the threshold of runway 24 right. Okay, so we are now lined up here on runway 24 right, which is the grass runway here at Duxford. Again, making sure we have the canopy closed up here ahead of the departure. And another quick check of the flight controls, just making sure everything is full and free, which it is. Lastly, making sure we have the gear up switch unguarded. Obviously, we are going to need that in just a moment's time. So we'll come off the brakes, up on the throttle. We're looking for 1.42 atmospheres here for the takeoff. That should give us 2700 RPM. And a little bit of right rudder initially here to keep the aircraft straight. Tail wheel coming up. I do find the FW190 tends to wander around quite a bit directionally during the takeoff, perhaps a little bit more so than would be realistic. And as well, the aircraft quite reticent, I find, to become airborne. The checklist calls for the flaps and the gear up below 250 kilometers an hour, but as you can see, we're only airborne there just shy of 300, probably around 270. Anyway, climbing away nicely, so we will tap the brakes, bring up the gear. We can do the same here as well with the flaps. And we'll make a left turn now back towards 1.3 atmospheres for the climb, and we'll just tighten up the turn, so putting on some bank angle, bring ourselves back into a left hand downwind for runway 24. do find the reflections there on the canopy a little bit overbearing. Obviously, to some degree, that's a sim issue as opposed to an aircraft issue, but it would be nice perhaps to have the option to turn those off, or better yet, still just reduce them in terms of their effect. So established on downwinds. Temperatures and pressures are looking good, and we do have gear up, lights out, flaps are up. As well, the flap indications there on the wing, both indicating 0. Maintaining 1.3 atmospheres for the time being then, just getting the aircraft trimmed out here in pitch. At the moment, the A-8 has a slight left wing down tendency. The real aircraft doesn't have a trim tab for the ailerons, or rather it does, but it's only a fixed trim tab. So for our first manoeuvre, we'll just make a pass down the flight line at relatively low speeds. And we'll cross the controls here as well, to some effect then presenting the aircraft to the crowd. And I'll try and talk you through how the aircraft feels to fly during the manoeuvre. So all the way back on the power, let the speed bleed off to some degree, doing about 400 kilometers an hour. I find the rudder of the A-8 feels pretty unresponsive actually at high speed, but at low speed pretty good. So we'll start feeding in left rudder. Again, crossing the controls, performing somewhat of a knife edge, and just using right aileron here to keep the aircraft tracking straight down runway 24 right. Overall, everything felt pretty reasonable there. I'll demonstrate later on. The aircraft does seem to model engine torque effects, but they don't feel that pronounced during typical phases of flight, which is a little bit surprising. Such a powerful engine. I believe the BMW 801 puts out around 1700 horsepower. Anyway, back in. Again, trying to keep things reasonably tight with the runway. Back for another downwind off runway 24. And back up towards 1.3 atmospheres. That oil temperature getting a little bit low. We're down to around 70 degrees Celsius now, so we'll just close up the radiator again. And this time we'll come over the field. We'll go for somewhat of a victory roll. We'll test out the roll performance later on with an aileron roll after we've done our first few manoeuvres. So again, turning back in towards the fields, we'll maintain 1.3 atmospheres. So runway out at 11 o'clock, straightening up again with the display line. Speed building up through 540 kilometers an hour. And we'll get ourselves low level. So back on the stick and pulling the aircraft around. Overall, as with every FlyingIron aircraft, the FW190 really pleasant to fly overall, very enjoyable. I wouldn't say it's the most realistic warbird flight model I've come across. As with any FlyingIron aircraft, I think there are some concessions made. both in terms of accessibility and also, of course, as a result of the limitations of the Microsoft Flight Simulator flight modelling. Although I know that would be a very contentious subject and I'm no expert on these sorts of aircraft. Personally, I do prefer the flight modelling somewhat more in DCS, for example, with these sorts of vintage warbirds. As well, there's a couple of really nice warbirds actually in X-Plane. I have a video in early access available there for the Skunkcraft P51, which is a really excellent add-on overall. Anyway, we'll come back through to 1.42 atmospheres now. That's full military power. We'll test out the emergency boost later on. So again, picking up some speed, lining ourselves up with runway 24. This time we're going to go for a loop. We'll try and get the aircraft up to around 600 kilometers an hour here before we enter the loop. And as with the FlyingIron simulations BF109, the loop is a little bit of a tricky manoeuvre to handle nicely here in the aircraft. I think that is the engine torque and prop effects starting to demonstrate themselves. So we'll come back on the stick. And you've got to be fairly aggressive here in the manoeuvre, otherwise you bleed off a lot of speed very quickly. So just coming over the top, and you can see there we've just slightly fallen out of alignment there with the runway, getting pulled around I think by the prop. So just straightening ourselves out. And that'll do us for now in terms of our sequence. Back up towards 1.3 atmospheres, we'll just head out now away from the field momentarily. Just keeping our bearings. So in terms of an aileron roll, the FW190 I gather was known for its roll rate. So we'll just go full deflection here out to the left, 400 kilometers an hour. And as you can see, we do get a nice high roll rate there out of the aircraft. In terms of turn rate here as well, so again 1.3 atmospheres, 400 kilometers an hour, just come fully back on the stick. I gather at high speeds the aircraft was actually prone to snapping a wing, and that does seem to be the case here as well with the flight model. So we'll just enter into that manoeuvre slightly more gently. We'll keep coming back on the stick, see what sort of turn rate we can get from the A-8. And again, if you just keep going, the aircraft will snap the wing. So lastly, we'll just try a stall. I do find the aircraft is slow to bleed off speed overall. It's actually quite hard to get the speed back here for the arrival without taking the gear and the flaps. Obviously it's a fighter, so it would want to be fairly low drag, but nevertheless I think at the moment it does feel a little bit difficult bleeding off speed. And apparently as well the real aircraft did have a decent amount of buffet before reaching the stall as a nice warning. Doesn't seem to be the case with the FlyingIron Simulations FW190. We just keep the stick back, keep the speed coming back. You'll see no buffeting there, just wanting to drop the wing, and if we keep the stick back, ultimately we will enter into a spin, but we're pretty close to the ground, so we'll avoid letting that develop any further. And then lastly, just looking at the prop effects in terms of torque, we'll talk more about that in just a second. We'll just get back a little bit more altitude, so back up to 1.3 atmospheres. Airfield just out of start, 10 o'clock. So we'll just get ourselves trimmed out here at 300 kilometers an hour. Pretty nice and stable. And we'll just roll the power off. You'll see there the aircraft wanting to go right wing down, and as we roll the power on, the engine there does exhibit a tendency to roll with power application, although I do have to say that tendency isn't super noticeable during the flight itself. Certainly not as noticeable as some other warbirds in other sims, or even FlyingIron's own F6F Hellcat. Anyway, we'll just make one orbit here, we'll build up a little bit of speed, and we'll come back for one last high speed, low level pass down the runway, so 1.4 atmospheres. Start picking up the speed, and again we'll use the emergency boost here for the manoeuvre. Oil temperature now 100 degrees Celsius, we'll keep a good eye on that, but we'll keep the radiator closed up for the time being. Okay, looking pretty good in terms of our positioning, so emergency boost, as you can see, that gives us around 1.6, 1.65 atmospheres in terms of engine output. And still maintaining around 2700 RPM. So speed building up nicely once again, 500 kilometers an hour. And again, we'll just make a nice low level pass, high speed, down the demonstration line. And hopefully as well we'll get a really great external shot of the flyby as we go. Okay, so braking back out to the left for another left-hand downwind, this time for a full stop landing. We'll get rid of the emergency boost before we turn that BMW engine into a bag of bolts. Just coming down through 500 kilometers an hour, we'll come all the way back now off the throttle. Again, you do need to be pretty proactive in terms of energy management. As I mentioned, the FW190 does take quite a bit of time to slow down. And not to say necessarily that that's inaccurate, of course it's a fighter aircraft, it's supposed to be low drag. But the manual calls for limit speeds on the flaps and the gear extension of 250 kilometers an hour, and as you'll see in just a moment's time, it takes us quite some time to get back towards those sorts of speeds. Anyway, established in the downwind. In terms of the downwind checks, brakes are checked and off, undercarriage will hold. Mixture is automatic. Fuel pumps are on. In terms of our fuel state, we've still got more than 400 litres there in the front tank, and about 170 now in the rear. Light instruments are checked, harness is secure. Looking good in terms of our positioning, just coming down through 300 kilometers an hour. And still maintaining level flight, you can see just approaching 250. We'll start the turn here, we'll bleed off just a little bit more speed in the turn. And below 250 kilometers an hour, so we'll take the gear down. Fine as well here, it's easiest just to come straight through to landing flap. Just to keep the drag, keep the speed back. So we've got a pin there on the left wing, pin there on the right wing, that's for the gear. We do have two greens. And showing 58 degrees there on the right, 58 degrees there on the left. Turning onto base, we'll feed in a little bit more power, just getting a little bit slow. We want 220 kilometers an hour here during the initial stages of the approach. All clear on final. We'll turn back in towards the field, needing quite a bit of nose up trim here as well. I find we need almost full nose up trim during the latter stages of the approach. We'll just feed in a little bit more power, keep the aircraft high initially. We want a steep approach here just to help us see over the nose. For our final checks, pitch is automatic, it's fully fine, undercarriage is down, flaps are set. Landing clearance has been received, the runway is clear. So 220 kilometers for now, back towards around 200 kilometers an hour over the threshold. And as you can see, visibility over the nose of the FW190, much like the BF109 and most other warbirds, not particularly brilliant, especially with those fairings for the guns. Just getting a little bit shallow here on the approach, so we'll feed in a little bit more power. There's the threshold for 24 right. Start coming back off the power now. Holding the aircraft off. A little bit high there, perhaps on the flare. A little bit of a bounce, and we're on the ground, fully back on the stick now. And we can start braking, come fairly aggressively onto the brakes, and bringing the FW190 to a crawl. Okay, so we're just taxiing back in towards the display line. We've got our row of Hurricanes and Spitfires there already parked up. We'll go and park up just on the right again of Romeo Foxtrot Romeo. And again, we'll just face onto the crowd, get the aircraft shut down. Overall, the ground handling of the FW190 doesn't feel quite as refined as it did on the F109. Obviously, the aircraft does have much wider landing gear, which does make it a little bit easier to taxi and handle on the ground. We'll talk more about that perhaps during the conclusions of the video. Onto the brakes, we'll set the park brake. We'll get the canopy opened up once again. In terms of the shutdown checks then, we'll bring the throttle back to idle. We can press and hold the engine stop. And you can see there we do have a good cut on the 801. Magnetos can go off. Fuel valve is closed. Fuel pumps are both off. Oxygen valve is closed. Canopy is open. Armament breakers are off. Rear breakers can all go off. And those are all set off. Rear brake panel is closed. For the front breakers, we'll take everything off here except for the battery. And I believe as well if we take off the flight instruments, that's going to trigger the aircraft to fully shut down in the sim and also close up the canopy, so we'll avoid turning those off here as well. So nav lights off, we'll leave the flight instruments on, and again just make sure those armament breakers are off. And we do have a good shutdown here on the FlyingIron simulations Focke-Wulf 190. Okay, so we'll just briefly run through the tablet as promised. We're not going to cover off anything here in too much detail since we've already taken a look at essentially the same tablet with multiple other FlyingIron simulations aircraft. Starting with the checklist page, that is fairly self-explanatory. We have the ability here to use the checklist via the tablet, also via the manual, and the checklist also built in within the sim. The V-Speeds page, again, fairly self-explanatory. That gives you the speeds and limitations of the aircraft. Live data, not too much to see here at the moment, but that puts out all of the various parameters of the aircraft and its systems. So for example, at the moment you can see there we've got the engine parameters, 1.03 on the atmospheres, underprimed on the engine, the hops timer there as well. I've got about 3 hours now and 15 minutes in the aircraft, and it has to be said that's really just flown by. The stats page, again, that will give you live real-time data once you're airborne. So there you can see, for example, altitude, climb rate, G-force, things of that nature. The loadout, that essentially just gives you the fuel loadout. So we have the front tank, the rear tank. We were using both of those for the flight today. We also have an AUX tank, and I believe as well we have the option for an external tank. Again though, no weapons loadout, no weapons options with the aircraft. For the autopilot page, a very simple autopilot included with the tablet, which I always think is a nice option. Not something I would use personally, but it's always a great feature to have within the sim. That'll just give you basic heading and altitude inputs for the aircraft, ease up the workload on those longer flights. For the workshop, you can see here we have the aircraft systems. Those do wear down over time. Fairly basic in terms of its implementation versus something like A2A, for example. But you can see we have worn through a little bit of our 25-hour inspection timing, depleted some of the onboard oxygen, and the spark plugs and the magnetos just starting to wear down there as well. Lastly, in terms of the settings page, we have the ability to remove the aircraft gun sights and gun counters and install instead of GPS. We also have the option to replace the Asobo avatar with a period correct World War II pilot avatar. We can hide the pilot from the external model for some nice external shots. We can also hide the control column internally. We can hide the spinning prop disc model, which is ideal, I believe, for VR users. We do have the option for simplified ground handling. Today we were obviously using the more realistic model. We'll talk more about that in just a moment's time. We also have the option for a basic radio and transponder that's installed down on the center console between the pilot's legs. You may have seen that during the flight. And lastly, fret not, but as you'll notice, we have English labeling throughout the cockpit. You can of course also replace that with German labeling for a more authentic experience. Under realism settings, we can stress and damage the aircraft. So for example, you can overstress the engine, that will lead to a failure. You can also damage the landing gear with a heavy landing, although I believe the A-8 is actually specifically designed to take a pretty hefty landing with the main gear. For the tablet preferences, we can just adjust the brightness. For the ground services, we can push back the aircraft. And as well, we can install some really nice period custom ground equipment, which you'll see in just a moment's time. My only minor gripe with the ground equipment tab, at the moment that operates everything on the aircraft at once. It would be really nice to selectively be able to choose pieces of ground equipment and as well to open up the engine cowl. Lastly, as mentioned during the flight, the FW190 has a fixed aileron trim tab, and you can adjust that via the tablet as the ground crew would do on the ground. The tablet though does allow you to adjust it whilst airborne, so you can trim out any rolling tendencies based on your current speed and power setting. So again there, just a quick look at the tablet. I'm sure much of that functionality will be familiar to many of you. That's about it then in terms of our look at the aircraft. We'll now finish up the video as usual. We'll just take a few minutes here to talk about my final thoughts regarding the product. So there you go, ladies and gents. I do hope you enjoyed our outing in the FlyingIron Simulations Focke-Wulf FW190 A8. The aircraft is undoubtedly another superb effort from the FlyingIron Simulations team. And as usual, we'll just cover off the product here in a little bit more detail at the end of the video. I'll cover off a few points that I didn't get a chance to discuss during the flight. So starting with the modelling and texturing, as ever an exemplary effort from FlyingIron Simulations. The level of detail with regards to both modelling and texturing really is rather exquisite. And so of course that does make the FlyingIron Simulations aircraft visually very appealing, fascinating to take a look around. Flight modelling, as usual, is really the hardest point for me to pin down here during the review, not having flown any similar aircraft myself in the real world. Overall, to me, the flight modelling does feel decent, although it is worth noting I think some concessions have been made here, both for the sim and also for the average user. Overall, I actually prefer the flight model of FlyingIron Simulations BF109. I think that aircraft felt a little bit more alive and keeps you a little bit more on edge. Certain behaviours do seem to be toned down, for example the engine torque. As I mentioned during the flight, I find that with FlyingIron Simulations' own F6F there's considerably more response there from the engine than you see here with the FW190. Briefly running through the flight phase by phase, FlyingIron Simulations have made a custom ground handling model and generally speaking it works okay. The aircraft will have a tendency to jump around a little bit during the initial stages of the taxi, but overall, even with the tailwheel locked, I would say the aircraft feels a little bit loose, a little bit vague on the tail during the taxi. The handling can also feel a little bit incremental as opposed to nice and smooth during the turns. The same is true during the initial stages of the takeoff. The Focke-Wulf FW190 is certainly much easier to handle during the takeoff and the landing versus FlyingIron Simulations' own BF109. That's to be expected, of course. The aircraft does have a much wider landing gear, making ground handling that much easier. During the takeoff, it felt to me as though the aircraft did have a little bit too much of a tendency to wander directionally, but of course it's possible that could be true to life. The manual calls for the takeoff at around 200 km an hour, but it felt to me as though the aircraft didn't want to comfortably unstick until around 220, 230 or thereabouts. Any slower than that and I found the aircraft wanting to drop a wing during the rotation. At least in comparison with the manual, the FW190 does seem to display most of the characteristic behaviours that FlyingIron Simulations state the aircraft should have. Again though, no buffet towards the entry of the stall there, which apparently there should be. During the approach, it was, as I mentioned, quite difficult to bleed off the speed, but again that may be true to life. As with any warbird, the A-8 can be quite a bit of a handful during the approach as well. It's very difficult to see over the nose. And you do also have to be very careful during the touchdown with any side slip. I find if you have any on, then the aircraft will very quickly get away from you. Once you're into that ground loop, it's pretty much impossible to recover. In summary then, to my mind, a solid effort certainly on the flight model, but not quite up there with the BF-109 or the F6F. Systems-wise, the aircraft is very good. All of the systems more or less seem to work. There's only one or two switches in the cockpit which don't function. The aircraft sits mid to high tier in terms of its systems modelling, in terms of how alive the FW190 actually feels. Temperatures and pressures will increase and decrease. You can damage and stress the engine. There is as well basic maintenance functionality via the tablet associated with that. Really, the only major systems that you're going to be missing functionality with are, of course, with regards to the weapons. I have mentioned similarly in other Flying Iron Simulations reviews that whilst, of course, Microsoft Flight Simulator is not a prime platform for weapon deployment, it really would be the icing on the cake, at least to my mind, with Flying Iron Simulations lineup, if we could have visually modelled weapons, at least in terms of gun, visual effects and sounds. With regards to sounds, overall Flying Iron Simulations have once again done a nice job with recreating the soundscape of the Focke-Wulf FW190. That being said, again, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's their best effort to date. Certainly, externally the aircraft sounds beautiful. Internally as well, the sounds are very good. Certainly the sound set does broadly capture the BMW 801. Comparing with real-world footage, I would say that the internal sound set does sound slightly flatter than the real-world aircraft. Similarly as well, there doesn't seem to be too much range in the sounds as the aircraft moves towards and away from you, as we saw during the taxi. And the same is true a little bit as well with the flyby. Initially the aircraft sounds decent as it heads towards the observer, although it is lacking some of the higher end notes I think of the BMW 801. Passing the observer though, definitely lacking a little bit in some of the engine sounds. You tend to get a bit of a chugging effect as the aircraft departs away. In terms of product extras, pretty much everything you would expect there from Flying Iron Simulations. We get a fairly decent manual, although again it is slightly more lightweight than the BF-109 manual in terms of figures, for example, for oil pressures and temperatures. And the manual overall I would say tends to focus a little bit more on systems and performance parameters as opposed to actually how to fly the aircraft. As well, we get the Flying Iron Simulations onboard tablet. We've already taken a look at that. And new as well to the Flying Iron Simulations lineup, we also get the option for some really nice, authentic World War II ground equipment, which you can see here in the video. Further to that, we also get the option to use either the default Asobo avatar or a custom World War II pilot model. And you'll have noticed here as well during the video that the cockpit labelling was in English, but certainly there is the option to switch that back out for the default and realistic German labelling. So overall, the extras included with the product are very competitive and certainly right up there in terms of what we expect from Flying Iron Simulations. Lastly, with regards to the aircraft's FPS, performance seemed to be very solid overall. I was maintaining above 60 FPS in the Würger at 4K and was seeing the same performance essentially as the default Cessna 152. Anyway guys, once again, I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please consider giving it a like. If you want to see more content from the channel, then please do consider subscribing as well. And once more, if you'd like to help support the channel further, you can do so by becoming a channel member or patron, and I'll leave a link to both of those down in the video description below. As per usual, a very big thank you to my channel members and patrons for all of your support and making this content possible. To all of you, I hope you are having a great day wherever you are. Take really good care, and I will see you all again soon.